Things change, but Deer Park Natural Spring Water is a constant you can count on, bringing you the essence of home for 150 years and counting. Sourced from carefully selected springs, Deer Park Natural Spring Water has naturally occurring electrolytes for a crisp, refreshing taste. Find Deer Park Natural Spring Water at your favorite local retailer today. After 150 years, there's only one thing left to say. Deer Park, that's still good water.
I'm Jason Pack, and this is Disorder, the podcast where we try to make a semblance of order out of our mad world. And one of the things I've been thinking about with our, increase in tribalism online, tribalism in person, over, a whole range of issues like Trump and Biden, Leave and Remain, Gaza and Israel, Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh, is how social media, cancel culture, and increased partisanship seems to have decreased people's empathy. Like they can connect if they meet someone in person and they're discussing something, but when they think in an abstract way about some issues and they read an article or they tweet something, they just don't think about how their words might affect someone else or what another perspective might be. So I think empathy is a really important and understudied concept. And to quote today's guest, despite its, meaning empathy's softer connotations, empathy is hard, requiring strategists to confront misperceptions and false assumptions, to overcome individual egos and national hubris. So what I'm going to hope we're going to try to do today is to change your views about empathy so that you can come away with the sense that empathy actually has more tooth and muscle in it. It requires courage, strength, humility, and a willingness to engage in difficult, maybe even impossible conversations. So who better to talk about what does empathy mean in geopolitics? How can we put empathy to practice in today's world? And what would it mean to use empathy as part and parcel of ordering the disorder? Who better to talk about all this than Dr. Claire Yorke? She is an author whose research explores the role and limitations of empathy and emotions in diplomacy, strategy, and leadership. She's currently a senior lecturer at the Australian War College in Canberra, where she's leading a course on strategic empathy in the Indo-Pacific. Before that, she completed a postdoc fellowship at Yale and one at the University of Southern Denmark. As you'll hear from her twang, she is from the north of England and began her career in politics in the UK, working at institutions that you've never heard of, like Chatham House and the British House of Commons. Welcome, Claire.
Thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to be here.
So, Claire, I really empathized with your not grasping that the time and the clocks would change, making scheduling an Australian morning British evening under British summertime more challenging.
I know. You've been really good at understanding the dilemma of the fact that your clocks went forward, mine went back. The time difference changed between scheduling, leading to a slightly different time than I imagined. But we are here bright and early, late at night.
And so that's what most people use when they think about empathy. Like, I say, hey, do you want to meet for dinner? I know that you live in Brixton and I live in Hampstead, and we meet somewhere not too far south and too far north, or we change times to meet so that it accommodates. Is that actually empathy, or are we misusing the word?
So in some ways, it's both. We use empathy so freely in our everyday conversations, exactly like you said, to understand where someone else is coming from, to understand their context, their experiences, what maybe the challenges they face right now might be. But a lot of what I do is argue there's far more to it, and that actually empathy changes depending on the context. It means something different when we then talk about it in diplomacy, or when we look at our political leaders and we look to them for greater empathy. So it's not just one thing, it's defined in different ways.
Right. And it might be defined in more positive some ways than are obvious. I'm going to postulate something. So you and I are going to meet for dinner. You live in Australia, I live in London, and we say, well, there's Mauritius, there's Madagascar, there's maybe Dubai. We empathize with the other's thing and we meet in the middle. But could it be that political empathy, people want to maximize their interests so they don't compromise, but it turns out that by compromising, they would actually be maximizing their interest, that there's something potentially positive sum that empathy can unlock, which is not obvious in the one-on-one compromise view of things.
Exactly. And it's interesting that you connect it to this idea of compromise. So when I talk about it in the context of politics, it is about understanding how to navigate these very different interests, these different perspectives and experiences. And in my view, that should help us create compromise solutions that in the longer term are actually far much better for more people. Maybe in the immediate term, there's a short-term loss of interest, or that you maybe are a little bit more put out in having to fly a little bit further than you wanted, but that in the longer term, we all gain, we all benefit from this process of understanding how to meet in the middle.
So what first is coming into my mind is that good diplomats have always had this. Are people getting worse at it? Do they, as we've gotten so overly siloed and thinking about like realist conceptions of interests, people have like forgotten what diplomacy is actually about?
So I'm writing a book right now on empathy and diplomacy. I'm finishing it off, and I've been talking to a lot of different diplomats from around the world as part of that. And so many of them cite this as an integral part of diplomacy. That's how they build relationships. It's how they build trust. It's how they understand the inner workings of the country that they're staying in and they're living in, and how they know how to navigate the dynamics when things go wrong. Ultimately, humans are emotional beings, and we can't avoid that, and we can't write that away and suddenly make us seem like these very rational, contained beings.
Might that be that if you look at things in a realist, interest-based approach to policy, particularly if you think that a given issue is zero-sum, you think there is X amount of rare earth minerals. We need to get more for us, which is going to mean less for them. Or we are car exporters and Germany is a car exporter. We need to have our cars better, and something which harms the German industry so that our industry can export more widgets or whatever, that's good. And that one of the implications of not just realist IR, but neoliberal economics is the idea of market competition as kind of the basis in which we engage in policy discussions?
But I think that's the problem, is that we've got into this model of one person can win, one person can dominate, that you have to be at the top in order to succeed in quite an extractive way. And especially when you're talking about the economy, this idea that you win by having domination of a market, it doesn't talk about all the other impacts of that. And especially with climate change, with the environment, with the well-being of workers and populations. These are such critical questions that we overlook when we only consider the economic game and that idea of dominating a market or winning at all costs. And so moving to a more empathetic mindset, moving to a mindset where you say, how do we collectively find solutions? How do we collectively gain and win here? Means accepting that maybe there's other models that will work better where we have power with others rather than power over others.
I think probably people have talked about, oh, it's important for a leader to understand their allies, understand their adversaries. Like American leaders always make a great show of we get that in Europe, you guys care more about this and that we care about that. And that when we're dealing with our opponents, they understand about this. This is the kind of name checking of empathy. So, we've heard former New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, the current PM of Barbados, Mia Mottley, they have all talked about empathy. And then even bizarrely, Trump talks about empathy with his supporters. But the mere fact that people use the word, does that mean that they actually embrace the concept? Or they're just throwing it out there?
That's the problem. Empathy can be very performative. Because we know it matters. We know people want to feel like they are seen and that they are heard and that they're understood. And so it can become politically something that is helpful to signal, I am human and I care about you and I understand what your concerns are. I think as well of that moment when Trump went to speak following a national tragedy in America, and they found his cards that he'd been given by his team that said, be empathetic, show that you care. We know that this is something that matters, but it starts to become empty if it's not matched by the integrity of action, that it just becomes a rhetorical device and people start to see through it, which then undermines its ability. If you're not actually going out there and meeting with people and using that knowledge and understanding to transform policy.
Okay, so why don't we put some meaning in here? Give us some concrete examples. Who are particularly empathetic political leaders? What are examples of kind of dynamic empathy in politics that you've seen in the last decade or so?
One of the really good examples of that is Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, as you mentioned earlier, following the Christchurch terrorist attacks, which happened in 2019, which was a series of attacks by a terrorist actor on Muslim population in Christchurch. Around, I think, 50 people were killed in that attack, and the Prime Minister made a real effort to go out to meet with the Muslim community and to convey through her words, through her actions after that crisis, we are not going to be defeated by this action of an individual. And she made a real point of not naming him, of not giving him the power or the attention that traditionally we had in the wake of a terrorist attack. She emphasized community, she emphasized unity and coming together. And so that picture of her where she's meeting with the local Muslim population with a headscarf on become very powerful examples of empathy in practice. And then following that, she also began an initiative working with Canada and France and other countries to address disinformation and radicalization online, which was a huge driver of some of that activity. So she put it into action, really. It wasn't just rhetoric. She was there, she was present, she was doing something with it.
Hearing you talk about Ardern, that just sounds like savvy politics to me. Is that empathy? In other words, is interfaith signaling and building out our common connections, is that actual empathy?
I mean, she spoke very actively in places like Davos about how empathy was a critical skill for her politics. So I believe it was a value that guides her leadership. Whether or not it's always constant, I don't know. I don't think it is with anyone, really. But she made a point of emphasizing its value. You had the New Zealand well-being budget as well, which was very much about bringing in different communities, creating a more inclusive society. So I think that was something that drives her anyway, and that her decision to respond that way came from her, from what I understand, was very kind of quite organic to her personality. But you do also get this signaling from different politicians. So it's knowing the difference. But often in the wake of a tragedy, we want to at least hear that they care.
Let's talk about empathy for a second in democracies opposed to autocracies. A lot of these displays of communal connection in democratic context are electoral in nature. In other words, the politician goes to the coal area because they're losing the jobs, but the votes from that are in a swing state. He goes to Sheffield because there's an important trade union presence, and you can't be labor leader if you don't have the trade unions. What about empathy in an autocratic context?
There you've got different mechanisms at play. You have the domination of one person, one party over a country. They don't maybe need to demonstrate that understanding. But at the same time, what I'm interested in is how do they build that base in the first place? Before you get to that point, for some countries where they've gone from democracy to autocracy, what did you see understanding? Did you see this development of support among people, of an expression of, I care about you, I'm going to look after your interests and your needs, and I'm listening? And it's interesting, I wrote an article a while ago, I'd argued in it that Obama had used empathy effectively, especially in the wake of some of the national tragedies in America. And the reviewer said, Obama is not great at empathy. He doesn't really listen to all the people. Trump does empathy well. And I remember sitting slightly uncomfortably with this comment on my article. But it does raise interesting questions about how do these leaders build their base? And I think what's interesting, especially in the case of Trump, is he will say to his base, this section of the political elite are not listening to you. They're not concerned with you. They don't care about you. Look at the policies they're introducing. Look at how they're denying you your interests and your needs. And I'm here and I'm listening. And I'm going to say it in whichever way it comes out because that's authentic. And I'm just going to speak my mind. And there is the argument that he uses it as well to signal exactly that idea of I'm with you, I'm on your side, at the expense of the political elite, creating that in-group. I don't think many of us would identify it with the idea of empathy that is kindness, but empathy doesn't always have to be kind.
Okay, so if I could sum up a little here, empathy might be important in politics because you have to show the people that you're representing in a democratic system that you get their concerns. And you might have to engage in some kind of ritualized behavior, having tea with the coal miners or going to a sports game, or like any American candidate going to an Iowa caucus, going to the state fair, checking out the prize pig, eating a pie, that this shows some kind of connection. But is that symbolism or is it real? Or can we get at something beyond that, like democratic connecting to the voters thing? What is strategic empathy?
So empathy and strategy is using this attempt to understand different people's perspectives and experiences and using that insight to guide better decision making, to understand a broader range of options that you have available, but also to understand how different people will experience the decisions that you're making, the implications of the policies that you're introducing. And that comes by knowing, for example, the history they've had with different interactions, the experiences that they've had with, when we talk about strategic empathy, it's at a national level, and therefore it's about understanding how other countries have experienced a country. So when America speaks about strategic empathy, that requires an understanding of how different countries have experienced America. And it's not always positive. We saw, for example, during the Cold War, there was a political psychologist advocating realistic empathy, this idea that you need to understand the Soviet Union as the Soviet Union understands itself. Because America was projecting onto the Soviet Union this idea of this red menace, this threat to American existence, it failed to understand the nuances of the country, what the weaknesses were, what the challenges it was facing internally was. And so this kind of empathy then informs a more nuanced approach. It means you don't project demonizing or enemy images in a way that distorts your capacity to make good decisions, to make decisions based in what's going on and in the complexity of a situation.
And we've certainly seen different political leaders like Jacinda Ardern who understand how to deal with different religious and cultural communities and empathize with them. But what about empathy in a military context? So after the break, we're going to hear from Claire about some of the harder, more geostrategic uses of empathy.
Things change, but Deer Park Natural Spring Water is a constant you can count on, bringing you the essence of home for 150 years and counting. Sourced from carefully selected springs, Deer Park Natural Spring Water has naturally occurring electrolytes for a crisp, refreshing taste. Find Deer Park Natural Spring Water at your favorite local retailer today. After 150 years, there's only one thing left to say. Deer Park, that's still good water.
You teach at a military institution. Why is empathy important for the military, and how can some of the failures, classical American failures like Vietnam or Afghanistan, be understood via an absence of empathy?
Empathy is often seen as at odds with the military because the military is about the use of force, about operating in very difficult conflict areas, obviously associated with the violence that we see. But it's also more than that. And when we look at some of the cases in history, you mentioned Vietnam, It's a really good example of what happens when empathy is absent. The former Secretary of Defense in the United States, Robert McNamara, wrote about how empathy was his main lesson from that conflict, that the Americans didn't understand their opponent. They didn't take the time to know why their enemy was fighting. They misread the signals. They misunderstood the situation. And as a result, it led to a prolonged war with a huge amount of loss of life on all sides that was unnecessary. It went on far longer than it had to. The techniques used didn't work. And if you look at people writing again from the field who were there, they were also struck by this lack of understanding of what they were dealing with. In Afghanistan, inability to fully understand what is really going on, how power is shaped within the communities, where it resides, the interests of the Taliban, what would make them come back, how they were willing to wait it out for the West to leave. There's a huge amount that wasn't understood, and it can be immensely costly for civilian lives, but also for military lives. So it's about bringing that into the decision-making to try and avoid those errors.
I think a lot of the empathy that you talked about there is actually just cultural knowledge. It's a famous quip that during the Vietnam War, there were less than 10 people in the entire United States government who could read Vietnamese. They just completely didn't understand the culture. And that's somehow quite different than in Afghanistan or in Iraq, where, we had hundreds or thousands of Arabic-speaking experts at the State Department and had been working with Saddam and, really understood the nuances of what's happening in Tikrit as opposed to in the Shia areas. And there might have been a lot of cultural understanding, but there wasn't necessarily empathy with the Iraqi experience, or there was just bad strategy. I think that it's important to differentiate those things. And maybe if we deal with the 90,000-pound elephant in the room, we can differentiate empathy from strategy, from cultural understanding. And this is, of course, the tragedies that are unfolding in Gaza and the horrific attacks of October 7th. To my mind, the attacks on October 7th are fading into the distant past in our conversations and have not necessarily been fully understood by many of the supporters of the pro-Palestinian cause. And it is obviously clear that on the right wing of the Israeli debate, the kind of settler debate, there is a complete and total lack of empathy or solidarity with Palestinian suffering. So it might seem to me that this conflict, more than any other that I'm aware of, it puts people into their different camps where they simply cannot empathize with each other. This is something unique, this deliberate veil that comes down where people don't empathize with the other side. Do they even try?
Yeah, I can't speak to whether or not they feel it, but I think what's going on in Gaza right now is certainly incredibly a difficult moment for empathy for multiple reasons. And I was struck by what Yuval Noah Harari wrote shortly after the October 7th attacks, where he said, we have no space for empathy right now. It's for those of you outside of this situation to hold that space for us. And I think that was a very powerful expression of the challenges when you're in the midst of a conflict, when you're in the midst of that suffering and that trauma. I'm not sure you can ask people to be empathetic. But what we can do from outside is really try and create that space, but also understand, how do we navigate this for the different people and the communities involved? How do we help to alleviate that suffering? How do we help to ensure that people have food, supplies, aid, support, whatever it is that's needed right now? But we're seeing as well this empathy fatigue, compassion fatigue, which is one of the challenges that people numb once it becomes too overwhelming. It becomes very hard to connect because it's so overwhelming. So then people don't want to talk about it, or they don't want to kind of express an opinion on it because it's so difficult for them to get into, or they're feeling incredibly angry, incredibly sad, traumatized, struggling to cope with what it means. And so there's a huge amount that's going on within this.
But might there not be something unique about the Israel-Palestine conflict in that it has for lack of a better term, a kind of football team partisans effect on people, whereby for most people who are not Middle East experts or trained in the Middle East as you and I are, and who are not, socially connected to people from lots of different groups and perspectives. You, for reasons of birth, religion, national origin, global South, global North, identify more with one side or another, and then you filter information through that. Just like if you're a fan of a given sports team and you win, you don't not cheer because you're like, oh God, I feel really bad for those people from Man United, they lost. We have a sense that it's absolutely acceptable in the context, particularly of kind of Premier League English football, that it's like you cheer, you carry on, you can even say some curses at the opposing team. You're not supposed to empathize with them, be like, oh, I feel really bad that he missed that penalty kick. That's not what the supporter feels when his team wins. Is something like that going on about this conflict, Israel-Palestine, that is potentially different from Turkish versus Greek Cyprus or the civil war in Sudan or a whole range of other things?
I think that's a difficult one with that analogy, because there are certainly different sides that people take and they kind of entrench within those sides, and then they are again speaking to other people with similar views to them, so you don't always get the other side. But I think it's possible to empathize simultaneously with the people who are the victims of the October 7th horrific attacks by Hamas, and also to empathize with the Palestinians who have lost their homes, their livelihoods, their loved ones. Critically, you've got over 30,000 people right now who've been killed. And I think those two can coexist, and it's really for people outside to help navigate how to have that conversation, to find a solution, to find a way through this.
To move beyond Israel and Gaza, because it's a very difficult and complicated thing to talk about, let's zoom out. How can we use the tools that you say about empathy to understand global order and the nature of our challenges?
I think it is this failure of political leadership that is so often responsible for problems within politics. We need good leaders who can create a vision of doing things differently, who can say there are other ways of being and doing. And empathy in changing world order is about creating more inclusive spaces. I think it's really interesting to look at what's going on with climate change negotiations and how it's often smaller states, island nation states who are saying, look, you're not taking us seriously enough. You're not listening to the concerns we have about how this is destroying our environment and our livelihoods and our well-being, and being very active and getting together as a group, as a collective, to really push for change. And I think by opening up spaces of dialogue within diplomacy, within international politics, for these different voices, and trying to listen more, for those people who have the power to listen more, to think about different ways of doing it, to realize there is huge value in these approaches, that it doesn't have to be, like you say, one person wins and that someone else loses, that there are going to be alternative ways of doing things, but it requires a leader who's able to communicate both within their country, but internationally. There are other ways of doing this, and we have to be able to be open to the compromises involved.
A lot of what you've said has sounded like this kind of soft empathy. Tell us more about the kind of hard empathy, the forcing the hard conversations that are maybe needed to solve something like climate change. In other words, that people need to change their behaviors or the amount that they drive, or in Israel-Palestine that some settlers are going to maybe have to leave their homes, but lots of Palestinians are going to have to go to jail and maybe give up arms or denounce other Palestinians and fight their tunnels. So tell us more about the hard parts of empathy.
This is a really important thing when we talk about empathy, is it's uncomfortable and it's hard, and it requires sitting down and talking to people who think very differently, and having political leaders who are able to communicate that the process of getting through challenge and division is going to be a hard one and a long one and require patience. And as a Brit, I think about it in the context of Brexit. I voted Remain. I am very European. I gained immensely from being a part of the European Union. I was an Erasmus student in France. So many of my friends live across Europe, and I'm used to being able to travel freely, to working there, to having the opportunities that have now gone. And so I still struggle, even though I study empathy, even though I advocate it. I struggle when sitting with people who are very adamant that this was the best decision for Britain. I'm not convinced they voted for the Britain that there is now, but there were frustrations with what was happening that those who voted Remain didn't fully understand. There were frustrations with the economic well-being of their regions, with the opportunities they had, with their identity as a Brit within the Union, that maybe those of us who felt very comfortable with that European identity didn't understand.
Okay, I'm going to be hyper elitist here. I understood both what Leave voters and Trump voters were voting for and why they might have wanted it. And I don't begrudge the people who had false consciousness. In other words, that they thought there have been so many dislocations, it's not fair, the elite's this, the blah, 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 screw those Europeans, you know. But I'm not sure that we need to empathize because the implications of what was sold them is just wrong. We on the center of these debates needed to offer better solutions so that people who suffered and lost their jobs and had certain complaints with a whole range of things that have been, screwed up in Anglo-American politics as a result of neoliberalism had better solutions for them. But to empathize with the actual things about neopopulism, which underlies Brexit and Trump, there's just so many mistaken ideas that we can't tolerate intolerance, can we?
No, and I think that's the thing is we shouldn't tolerate, and empathy can have boundaries. And this is one thing when we talk about empathy being hard is you can communicate those boundaries. I am willing to understand, I'm open to listening, but these are my red lines. This is where I just don't agree. I don't agree with the use of violence. I don't agree with whatever it is that the boundaries are. But I think what's critical, especially within the case of Brexit, even while you may not empathize with those or you understood why they did it, but you don't want to tolerate the opinion, the process of getting through what we're in right now within Britain is going to require sitting down and listening to different concerns and getting people to talk about how we get through. So they do need better solutions. You're right. We need far better solutions. But to get to them, we need to engage in empathy, in understanding why different people are looking for different things, what their grievances are, what their hopes and aspirations are, and how then they meet somewhere where they can meet. Can people move more to a common ground? And that's through the process of listening and understanding and dialogue. That's not going to be easy. And that is going to require some boundaries.
Okay, empathy, it's not easy. So, what do we need to do to bring more empathy into our lives at, say, the local level? How can empathy be useful in people's engagement in school board, housing association kind of politics?
Very small, simple first step. Listen. Really actively listen to what other people say. Ask questions and be curious. I'm always struck by how you can meet people and they'll never ask a question, or they'll assume they know the answers, or they know about what the right solution is. And I think just at a local level, asking the questions about different people, taking the time to listen, to get to discover points that you might have in common, and then allowing that to open up different avenues.
But at the big national level, are people ready for more empathetic politics? How are we going to get to this globally empathetic politics that can help us order the disorder?
At a national level, we need leaders who don't just use it rhetorically, but who actually take the time and effort to meet with different people outside their bubble, get into communities, talk to people, listen to people, and match what they say with what they'll do. We need far more integrity in politics. You need more of an alignment with words and actions. And we need leaders who are willing to create the spaces for the difficult conversations, who are willing to kind of put the work in and not just do things for the likes or for a quick win, but do the long-term political vision. Provide a bigger vision of how we can come together more, how we can do more to understand each other. But I think there's also at the institutional level, opening up political spaces to give more ability for different states to have a say, to have their voices heard, and to create more opportunities for that more collective politics, especially on those transnational global issues that we're struggling with collectively.
So, to wrap up, what does all of this have to say about global order, international order, or just empathy and the sense of feeling that we're living in an ordered and inclusive and collaborative space?
I think a fundamental truth about humans is we want to feel like we are seen and that we're heard and that we matter in some form. And so empathy, therefore, is a critical part of that process of engaging with people, of connecting them with politics, of helping create the societies where we can thrive, where we can coexist. But at an international level and in creating order, it's really about challenging ideas of power over, moving to more inclusive processes, to bring in different voices, to bring in different perspectives, and about really understanding that there's no one explanation of this world. There are multiple experiences of it. We have to coexist within that, and finding ways to navigate that are fruitful and productive, even if they're hard and difficult and uncomfortable. And that's just an essential and unavoidable part of what we're experiencing right now.
Well, that's it for this week. If you too empathize with the plight of having to stay up very, very late or wake up very, very early because someone is in the antipodes, we are happy that you can empathize with this, and then you should tap follow right now so you will be notified when every episode launches. We're on social media too. Just search Disorder Show. And the key thing is we're all about our Substack now. So please empathize with me. Empathize with how much effort I'm putting into this Substack. Just subscribe, please. It's free. Empathize with this Substack. You're going to get lots of information like Claire's really interesting academic articles and some of the work that she's done on this topic, strategic empathy. And yeah, you know the man who really empathizes the most? He's our producer, George McDonough, and our executive producer, Neil Fern. I empathize with the amount of work that they put in, having to listen to my goddamn voice all the time. Jesus Christ, you guys are so patient and empathetic and good. So even more than the listeners, I'm wishing you too an orderly week.